Coming up on this edition of the Black Vault Radio, Dr. John Alexander steps into the vault to talk about his military career as a U.S. Army Colonel of Infantry, his experiences on the mysterious Skinwalker Ranch, and we explore a little-known UFO research program he was involved in during the mid-1980s.
And our premise initially was, okay, somebody's doing this. We assumed Roswell was real. What we determined with all of those folks, agencies that I mentioned, everybody thought somebody else was doing it, had common knowledge, and the bottom line was nobody was in charge. I've had other occasions where you attempt to study things the way one normally would approach it from a scientific perspective, and it just changes. Again, it is in charge. Inside the heart, inside the pericardium, which is intact, is pulverized. And have no idea how you could physically do that.
All that and much more. So stay tuned. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey. My quest for the truth. My name is John Greenewald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is another edition of the Black Vault Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in and subscribing. No matter how you are listening, I do appreciate it. I know there are millions of options out there on different shows to tune into, so I do appreciate you choosing the Black Vault Radio to pay attention to. Now, just a couple of things before we get started. You'll hear me plug the show notes page a few times throughout this broadcast. And the reason is I want to make sure you are aware of it. Now, what the show notes page is literally what it sounds. It is a breakdown of all of the links and all of the pages and all of the topics that I'm about to talk about, not only through the interview segment, and this episode I am bringing on Dr. John Alexander, but also quite a few other segments, including the news and including the TBV Unredacted segment where I profile a document. The show notes page can be accessed at www.theblackvault.com/show notes, and it will break down every episode. For your reference, this is episode number 4. And again, my guest, Dr. John Alexander, will be joining me in just a little bit, and we're going to dive into all sorts of interesting topics. He is a very fascinating man with an extensive history, so stay tuned for that. But check out that show notes page, because also on there are subscribe buttons. So if you're not subscribed yet, make sure you go on there, find whatever choice you want, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Store, whatever you decide to use. There are shortcuts to the Black Vault Radio, so that way you are updated every time a new episode is posted. Now, another quick note you guys may have noticed, and maybe you're actually listening to the show via this method right now. But on Friday evenings, in the last couple of weeks, I have broadcast the entire show of the Black Vault Radio on a Friday night. Now, this was more of a unadvertised test, and I was pleased to see that the radio program was watched and listened to on a Facebook Live video quite a few thousand times throughout the last couple of weeks. Now, again, I didn't advertise this. I just started it at a random time on a Friday evening. This was kind of a technical test for me, just to make sure that everything worked okay. It was also just to kind of see the reach of how far it went without ever mentioning it or ever saying, hey, at 6 o'clock or at 9 o'clock or whatever time I'm going to be playing this, make sure you tune in. And I was very happy with the results. Everything worked great. I saw many people watching. I tried to pop into the chat from time to time as it streamed through live. Tried to get some quality feedback and notes from everybody listening, and everything seemed to be solid. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is I'm going to be setting up 2 times on Friday night. Now, I know that my show here is a little unorthodox, meaning most shows are Tuesday nights at 9 Eastern or 5 nights a week, so tune in at 7 o'clock. And I'm not trying to follow a clock like that. Number one, I'm friends with a lot of those shows. I'm not trying to find that sweet spot where I can compete with everybody. But on top of that, it's more or less to give you guys just some options of listening. And so there's no traditional clock that I follow in the show. So sometimes shows are 2+ hours, hour 45 minutes, whatever I feel is, again, a good show that teaches you guys stuff but doesn't bore you to death because we're trying to fill the time. Now, on Friday nights, 2 times, I am going to be broadcasting this particular show. Now, the reason I'm doing this and trying to choose a good time is I want to be able to have a meetup with everybody that listens to the show. Now, obviously, if you subscribe to it, you might be notified on Tuesday or Wednesday, so you might have 2 days to have listened to the show. But the reason why I'm broadcasting it then on Friday nights at set times is so you guys all have a way to communicate with each other. This is a way to kind of bring the community and the listenership together where you can listen on Facebook Live. There's a chat room. You can comment on the different segments that are on the show, comment on the guest that week, and talk with each other. And it's a way to just kind of come together and have a fun meetup on a Friday night. Now, why 2? Well, the reason why 2, sadly, is that Facebook does not allow you to stream on any other social network other than its own at that time. And I believe YouTube is the same way. And what that means is my software has the capability of doing it, but unfortunately, those social networks don't like that dual feed. So if you're going to be streaming on YouTube, it won't allow you to stream on Facebook, and I believe vice versa, because the tests were not going well when I was adding in multiple social networks. So what I'm going to do is pick 2 different times, probably 2 hours apart. That way, East Coast has a reasonable time, West Coast has a reasonable time, again, separated by 2 hours. 1 on Facebook, 1 on YouTube. I may throw Periscope in there, which is Twitter's live feed. I do have 20+ thousand followers on Twitter, so I'm going to experiment with that. But for the most part, I'm going to start with Facebook and YouTube. What I need from you is some feedback on what times work for you. Would you like to listen to 7 o'clock Pacific time, or 8 o'clock Eastern time, or what works for you? Give me a line or place a comment on wherever you're listening. Let me know what times work for you. Because once we lock it down, then that'll be the standard broadcast meetup time where everybody can come together, listen to that week's show, and just have a good time. So make sure you pay attention to that. Let me know what times work for you. Now, another thing that I want to mention, there's quite a few new cases from the TBV investigations group that went online this week. If you didn't listen to past episodes, I think I talked about this on episode number 1. And this is a group that I started late in 2017, and in essence, bringing investigators together, giving them the tools they need to literally investigate the cases that were coming into the Black Vault. Now, this obviously is a little away from the government documents, although sometimes they do tie in when it comes to tower records and documents that relate to UFO-related sightings. But in other words, I was trying to create a group and a resource for people to come together and not only report their experiences, but then have a team to back it up and to take along that information and investigate it, analyze the videos, look at the photographs if there are any, and then create reports. And I'm pleased at this team. They are rock stars across the board. They do great work. They really dive deep into the cases, try and figure out what the evidence is, what the evidence is not, and make a report. Sometimes they have a great conclusion. Other times they can't form a conclusion just because of lack of evidence. And so what we do is we literally state that. in the report. Everything goes on a global map, so definitely check this out, theblackvault.com/case files. And when you go there, you will have access to literally thousands of cases that have been put into this, all with various levels of investigation. But the most recent are the TBV investigators that are coming aboard and tackling these cases. And my compliments to all of them, because they work hard. They do great work. I have zero complaints whatsoever, because these guys and gals, they really are taking on some of these cases, and they're not easy, and trying to get answers. So if you're wanting to be involved in something like that, there's room for more investigators. We have about 40 in 8 different countries right now. Not a huge team, but I'm not looking for quantity, but rather looking for quality. And if you're interested in maybe joining up, drop me a line. Just go to theblackvault.com. Look for any contact page that will come directly to me, and we'll chat. We'll see what you're interested in doing, interested in not doing, and kind of go from there. The next few weeks are going to be a little bit tough for me, but I do want to tease for the first time. I've never talked about this, but for the first time, a few months ago, I signed a book deal, which I'm very, very excited about. And the book premise is that I am diving deep, and I mean deep, into the world of government secrecy related to the UFO phenomena, using only government documents, using only the evidence they have given me. I am doing a fairly large book outlining what the government wants you to believe, what the U.S. military wants you to believe, and what their own evidence states. Now, obviously, I've published a couple books in the past, but this is actually taking it to the next level, bringing you all the way through 2018 and discoveries that have been made just in the last 6 months. And so all of that is profiled in the book. Now, I don't have an exact release date yet. I just have the delivery date. But I can tell you the deal is signed. The book is coming out. I got a look at the book cover, and it takes a lot for me to kind of get giddy about something. But I'll tell you, I was pretty thrilled when I saw the book cover and what the artist came up with. So stay tuned for more updates on that. If you don't see a lot of additions to the site from me in the next few weeks, that is because my deadline is literally like a couple weeks away. So I'm desperately trying to finish this thing and make sure that it is something that is very worthwhile picking up, and also has things that you've never seen or heard from me before. Already there's quite a bit of that, but I want to make sure throughout, even to the end of the book, you guys remain interested and glued to what that information is, because I'm telling you, you don't need to make up stuff. You don't need to go into leaked documents or any kind of shadowy figures that appear in a garage somewhere that told me a story. Although those narratives are kind of neat sometimes, they don't really help us understand what the true reality is. And when you look at the real stuff, the documents that cannot be refuted, there is an amazing story to tell, and that's what this book is all about. So that being said, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Black Vault Radio. Before we get to Dr. John Alexander, I'm going to talk about a few news headlines this week on TBV News. All right, in this episode's TBV News segment, there are a few stories that I want to go over that you may or may not have missed. Now, the first one I want to start with is regarding President Donald Trump's announcement of a Space Force. Now, if you did not hear about this is a fairly interesting development where President Trump has decided to propose a new branch of the military. Now, obviously, anybody with any interest in aliens, extraterrestrials, or UFOs was all over this story. And the reason was because the conspiracy theories flew that, well, why do we need a military presence in space? Why do we need to protect ourselves? What are we doing? This is proof. This is start of disclosure. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't believe that that is what this is. I believe that we need to protect ourselves in the form of some type of defense. And, with that will come offensive technology as well. But we need to defend ourselves from above. And that is because the enemies that we have on this planet, whether or not they are considered allies or not, there are some that you really can define as an enemy, or that they want to see harm done to us. The next 9/11 is believed to either be cyber or from above. meaning from space. Now, missile launches are getting to near space levels. Intercontinental ballistic missiles can get into space or near space. And so these things can go up and travel halfway across the world, come back down, and there we go. Now, the idea is that this Space Force is going to be a new branch of the military, but in essence protect us, I think, from ourselves, and that is what we need. But the question mark is, well, is there something else? Is there something else that we need to defend ourselves against? And to be honest with you, I don't think that is what this is all about, but it is worth a mention. Now, this week, the NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine, he came out with full support over Trump's announcement of the Space Force, and he issued some statements. He even likened the need for this to banking transactions and the need for GPS signals. And he said, and I quote, "Every banking transaction requires a GPS signal for timing. You lose the GPS signal, and guess what you lose? You lose banking." So he's seeing this as very much a protective stance on a terrorist attack. Because again, if that next 9/11 comes from above and they wipe out satellites or detonate something in space that harms our satellites, we are going to have a huge problem. So I think we do need to do this. Here's another interesting development, though, that a new debate is starting to form. And this debate is whether or not the existence and the creation of a Space Force by the U.S. is in violation of a treaty that we signed back in 1967. Now, it's nicknamed the Outer Space Treaty, but the formal name was Treaty on Principles Governing Activities of States and the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. So we signed this thing with the former Soviet Union and other countries, I believe, as well. And in essence, what they were trying to do was establish space as a very peaceful territory, that there wasn't going to be a race to not only get to the moon, which obviously we had won, unless you believe in all those conspiracy theories about the moon landing, which I do not. But if we landed on the moon and won that space race, the next step was militarizing space. Now, to bring up a couple key government documents, and I'll link this in the show notes as well, there were military plans through the Apollo era. One was called Project Horizon. And Horizon was literally a Department of Defense-backed plan that, although there were scientific missions to the Apollo launches and the astronauts undergoing the different experiments that they did on the moon, there was a secret study to actually create a Department of Defense outpost. Now, I have the declassified documents and the outline of what the DoD actually wanted to build. And although, from what we know anyway, it was never built, these documents are amazing to look at, and it's something that I would highly recommend you do. Check out the link in the show notes, or just search theblackvault.com for Project Horizon, and you will come up with those records. Another set that I'll bring up too, and maybe this was better served in TBV Unredacted, but I'll be plugging something else in that segment. But I do want to point these records out because they're actually not very well known. So Project Horizon was one. Project A119 was another. Now, what A119 was we were going to take a nuclear weapon to the surface of the moon and detonate it just to see what happens. Now, that seems pretty safe, doesn't it? Taking a nuclear weapon into space on the surface of the moon and just blowing it up for the pure sake of finding out what happens. Now, I've got all those declassified plans as well, and, well, allegedly we never did that plan either, but it was something that they wanted to do. Now, this treaty obviously spoke directly towards operations just like that, experiments just like that. We wanted to keep space a peaceful zone. Well, this treaty is still on the books as far as I know. It has never been, we've never exited from our agreement to it. And so this is on the book. So now the big debate on a legal standpoint, and this was written on a blog called lawfulpolitics.com, they broke down whether or not this is even lawful. And so I would recommend checking that out because although it sounds cool to have a space force and, hoorah, go America, and we're going to, bring every gun and weapon that we have to the space realm, it may not be legal at this point. So certain things are going to happen in order for us to do that. So keep your eye on that story, because although on the surface, yes, of course, it's fascinating, deeper down, there is going to be a huge battle on whether or not the Space Force can actually exist. Another story I want to deal with comes from a friend of mine. His name is Jason Leopold. He is one of the few people, and I mean this literally, one of the very few people that I respect when it comes to Freedom of Information Act requests, research, and everything that goes along with that. And he is a mastermind when it comes to the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, as you all know, I love utilizing that tool. But he has done some amazing stuff. Now, this week he is working for BuzzFeed, and he got some documents through a FOIA litigation suit, meaning he went all the way to the courtrooms to get the NSA to release these things, and actually discovered emails, one in particular from the National Security Agency director at the time. And at the time they were written in February of 2017, that was Admiral Mike Rogers. And it really showed a sneak peek at the intelligence communities and how they were dealing with, this isn't a political statement or anything, but really these charged tweets that Trump is sending out. Whether you like them or not, you have to admit some of these things are just off the wall and not really sitting well with these intelligence agencies. And this particular email was a string that went back and forth, starting to the Admiral, alerting him to the tweets that Donald Trump was sending out, literally accusing the National Security Agency and the FBI as potentially being the leakers of giving information to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now, when you make those accusations, sitting president or not, that doesn't sit well with something like the NSA. So these emails started going back and forth, and Admiral Rogers had got this, got alerted to it, verified it, and in one of the declassified emails, and my compliments to Jason Leopold and BuzzFeed News for getting these things, because again, they went all the way to the courtroom to do it. I'm going to read you the email that Admiral Rogers responded to some of his upper staff. He says, "We will not get sucked into this. Everyone needs to do their job and do it in our normal, professional, and forthright manner. Our behavior will be driven by the standards of our sorry, it's a little hard to read in this because there's a lot of crossed out information. Our behavior will be driven by the standards of our profession and not the comments or views of others. No tit-for-tat pettiness from anyone at NSA on this. We do not condone the leaking of classified or sensitive information, and anyone at NSA determined to be behaving in such a manner will be held accountable, and I don't care about their rank or position." Pretty strongly worded message there, but obviously he was trying to remove himself along with his agency from getting into a tweet war or some kind of textual battle between the president and his agency. So compliments to Jason Leopold and BuzzFeed for getting that out. In fact, they do a lot of stuff spearheaded by Jason Leopold under the FOIA. So I would watch headlines by him. Check him out on Twitter or Facebook. I believe he mostly posts on Twitter, and I'll link to his page as well. But if you like all things FOIA, definitely have Jason Leopold on your list. Now, the last story that I want to mention to you is a new show coming out on the History Channel. Now, as some of you may or may not know, I've worked as a producer many, many times for that network on various programs as a producer, writer, director, whatever the show entailed. And I have a lot of respect for that network. I am concerned about a new show that they're coming out with on Project Blue Book. Now, I've written extensively on Project Blue Book, found myself entwined in a Project Blue Book story a few years back that was not entirely accurate, as reported by the media. But that's a show for another day. And I'm rather passionate about the truth behind a lot of this stuff. And what I mean by that is it irks me more than I could ever explain when things are not dealt with in a truthful manner. And I watched the trailer. It looks very cool. From the producer part of me, I look at it. It's beautifully shot. There's great actors. You'll see the Game of Thrones actor Aidan Gillen, who's playing Dr. J. Allen Hynek in this series. But it looks fairly sensationalized. It is done by Robert Zemeckis, obviously a very big name in the field of entertainment altogether, let alone for now joining the ranks of producing and directing for the History Channel. That's a heck of a name to get. Now, it looks great, but I'm concerned that this is going to be a fairly sensationalized story. And when you watch this, here's my kind of friendly caution. When you watch it, don't buy it as that it's a historical narrative of exactly what happened with Project Blue Book. I hope it is. It just doesn't look like it. And it looks fairly sensationalized. And the real story behind Dr. J. Allen Hynek is something that is very worth telling. It is an amazing story where he goes from a skeptic to a believer. After investigating these things, he comes out of this couple-decade-long investigation by the United States Air Force into the UFO phenomena. Again, began as that debunker, and he exited a believer. He realized that there was a lot more to this, goes on to start his own UFO investigative group, and so on. So his real story, not sensationalized, is an amazing one to tell. I'm concerned that that historical significance behind Dr. J. Allen Hynek and what he truly did for this field may get Hollywoodized in this particular series. I hope that's not the case, but I'm going to try and tune in and watch the episodes and see, how much sensationalism they actually did go here. I hope it's not. I hope they stick with history and his real story, because that is fascinating enough. But make sure you stay tuned for the History Channel. The series is called Project Blue Book, and it will be starting fairly soon on the network. So that said, those are the headlines I want to deal with. Now it's time for Dr. John Alexander to join me in this episode's TBV Dialogues. On this episode's TBV Dialogue segment, I welcome Dr. John Alexander. Dr. Alexander has been a leading advocate for the development of non-lethal weapons since he created renewed interest in the field starting in 1989. In 2003, he served as a mentor to Afghan Ministry of Defense senior officials through the Office of Military Cooperation in Afghanistan. He entered the U.S. Army as a private in 1956, and he rose all the way through the ranks to Sergeant First Class and was a colonel of infantry in 1988 when he retired. Dr. Alexander has published articles in Harvard International Review, Jane's International Defense Review, the Boston Globe, the Futurist, the Washington Post, and several other journals. He's appeared frequently on television, including Dateline, Fox News, Larry King, CNN, MSNBC, Newsweek, and he has authored numerous books, including most recently, Reality Denied, First-Hand Experience with Things That Can Happen, But Did. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Alexander. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, John. Great to be here.
I'm excited to have you on the program just because I've known about your background for quite some time. I don't know if you recall, we met each other in person many years ago, I believe in Las Vegas at a conference. And your background has...
We've also met at the IUFOC.
That's right. And your background has always intrigued me because anybody with such an extensive background is someone that I like to pay attention to. So I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me here on the Black Vault Radio. So let me just have you start with a bit about your background. I know I kind of gave the audience a little bit in the intro there, but tell me about really what your interest is from the military and even post-military. What is your aim and angle?
Well, my interest actually started pre-military, going back to the very earliest sightings in 47. I was in a very unique grade school at the time, and I actually remember having a radio program myself, which we did internally, and talking about the early UFO sightings. So I've always had an interest in that and other topics. What emerged is that as eventually I did move up the food chain and got in a position where I could make some things happen. And when I was still a lieutenant colonel, decided to explore as formally as I could the UFO program and actually put together groups of people to explore the issues internally. We might address what our expectations were and what we found, because they were quite different. And then have continued interest ever since. You may know I worked for Bob Bigelow at NIDS. Mm-hmm. Was the first guy there, and they were specifically looking at UFOs, of course. And I might mention that in Reality Denied, the second chapter in particular is a case that some of your folks will recognize, and that's Chris Bledsoe. Mm-hmm. But I had a personal experience with him that was pretty striking.
Well, let's talk about that. Let us know, how long ago was that, and what did you guys experience?
Yeah, this was just a couple of years ago. I had heard about Chris and had actually recorded and interviewed him in this very, very long, complex story where there is not just one phenomena at all. Yes, there are UFOs, but there's missing time, spontaneous healing, interactions with sentient beings of some kind. And so we had gone, my wife and I had gone out to visit him. And this particular day, we had gone down on the Cape Fear River where the initial incident began. And what happened was that it was pretty late in the afternoon, just turning dark. We went down. He was pointing out where various things happened. Went back up a couple hundred meters to where the car was parked. And Victoria and his daughter are in the back seat of the car chit-chatting, and Chris and I are leaning against the left front fender. And all of a sudden he says, "Oh, I think they're here." And within 10 seconds, this thing pops into view and goes zipping off. And of course, I say it is the temporal relationship between him saying, "I think they're here," and an object appearing that definitely got my attention.
Was this your first UFO sighting that you had ever experienced?
No, I had one minor one, certainly the most dramatic, but I had one up in Washington at James Gilliland's place. And that was, like I say, much simpler. I was out alone in a field there and was watching. I actually had night vision goggles, pretty good third gen, and I was watching, satellites and things moving across, and then all of a sudden this one stopped. And you go, satellites don't stop.
Yeah, James Gilliland's ranch, I've been up there, and it's an experience. I've known James for a long time, and I was fairly skeptical going up there. And when you're there, I mean, not only is it just a beautiful place, but I'll give him that there are some strange things that go on up there. I don't know what it is, but since you experienced, and I wouldn't say that I saw a UFO per se, but there's definitely something a little bit intriguing about James Gilliland's ranch. So,
well, as you know, it's not just UFOs, and I did have a chance to talk to a number of people in the vicinity, specifically on Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or cryptozoology, however you want to say it. And basically everybody in the area has had what they report as firsthand experiences.
And do you think that there's a connection then between all of these facets of the paranormal and the regions that they are seen? It sounds like you see a connection between the phenomena, but do you think there's a connection with the regions that they exist in?
Well, that's two very different questions. The first one, and it's a slide that I use in every presentation, and I say, okay, we'll take UFOs, even cryptozoology, but near-death experiences, psychokinesis, interspecies communications, post-mortem communication, etc., and say, yeah, I think they are all interrelated in some way, and I think that human consciousness is a key piece of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you get down to or ask the question about, what's the driving force and why do these things appear, that is a little bit more intricate.
Recently, I had Joshua P. Warren on the show, and the reason why I asked you about the region is he was talking about Puerto Rico. And now, obviously, you and I are chatting about Washington and how it's not just UFOs in and around Gilliland's ranch. So that's why I was curious if you felt that regions or even cultures are more susceptible to these types of experiences.
Short answer would be yes, but I think that's only a piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
In my UFO book, and based on the experiences that I had at Skinwalker Ranch, we might want to discuss that, but I was with Bob the day he went up and bought the ranch and was the first one to spend the night there.
Mm-hmm.
But it was because of the extreme natures of the phenomena, and again, widely varied, that I came up with a concept what I called a precognitive sentient phenomena. And by precognitive, I meant that it, whatever it is, knew how we as scientists would respond to various presentations before it occurred.
Mm-hmm.
It is certainly sentient and smart and very clearly phenomena, much like what you hear about, Cocopelli and Pan and, the trickster kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I want to emphasize, though, is it is in charge. We're not. We are always on the catch-up end of things.
Can you give everybody, for those that don't know, a short synopsis of what the Skinwalker Ranch is, and then I want to focus on that a little bit. But can you just give everyone an introduction to it?
Well, there's a ranch that was owned by Bob Bigelow. He has since sold it, but it was one that was known to have very strange occurrences, and if you want, we can discuss some of the kinds of things. And weird things, and I don't think there's any other word better than weird, have been going on for decades to centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So this, again, topographically, is an area that seems to concentrate strange events. What we did, we was NIDS, National Institute for Discovery Science, had basically instrumented the ranch and had observations up there for long periods of time. This went on for 6 years, and then there was some future work after that. But, like I said, very, very strange occurrences that undeniably true were happening, and that's what made it interesting to examine. I might point out that as we looked at these things, you'd get certain observations, strange things would happen. And when you would account for that, and we did have, for instance, cameras that were doing 24/7 time-lapse photography, and then something would happen. You go, wow, that's interesting. So you'd adjust to that,
mm-hmm.
and it, again, would say, oh, you like that? Try this. And you would get something totally different, often like just off outside the camera range. And like I say, it is one of the strangest places. Not that there aren't others. There are other areas
mm-hmm.
that this seems to happen. And I think your question about are there cultural differences, that's probably some of it. But again, the physical reality of these strange events is pretty much undeniable.
Now, what were some of the types of events that happened at Skinwalker? And if you were there during those times, can you talk a little bit more in detail about what you saw or experienced?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that I didn't physically have anything strange happened while I was observing it.
Okay.
If anything, you may know Eric Davis, who was one of our guys, seemed to be more sensitive to it.
Mm-hmm.
One that happened with Terry that's always exciting, Terry Sherman, who had the ranch before Bob. He talks about, he sees, he's just developing the ranch and sees his dog coming across the field. And as the dog gets closer, he suddenly realizes that's not a dog, that's a wolf. And when it gets really close, it's standing next to him like it's domesticated. Snout is in his chest, and Terry's a big guy. So this is a really big wolf. Pets it and whatnot. A short time later, he hears this yowling, and what had happened is that he had some fencing there, metal fencing, where maybe 12 inches between the bars. The wolf has reached underneath and grabbed a 600-pound calf by the snout and is trying to pull it out. So Terry takes a 2x4 and whacks it, which barely gets his attention. He reaches in his car, or a truck that's there, I believe it was a .357 Magnum, and puts 6 rounds in basically the heart area at almost point-blank range. That convinces the wolf to walk away, which is amazing. So Terry had an elk rifle, hits it with a, I believe, 258 grain bullet, designed to bring down big animals, and stuff kind of flies off of the wolf, but it continues on and disappears. Also interesting is he goes over and picks up this chunks of flesh that have fallen off, and it's putrefied. And you don't get putrefaction instantaneously, obviously. That takes quite a while. So that's one. One that I think people have heard about is we had 2 observers on the top of Mesa. I might mention along the left side or north side of the ranch is a mesa. It goes up a couple hundred feet. The rest of it is just totally flat, Russian olives, pretty good visibility through most of it. But they're up watching with, again, night vision goggles, and about, I think it was around 2 in the morning, they're getting ready to call it a night, and they see a spot of light as hovering apparently just above the dirt road below. Light expands. For time's sake, we'll cut it a bit. But anyway, some kind of creepy crawler comes up, out, is probably about 6 foot tall, comes out of what appears to be a tunnel, jumps down, and goes running off. Light disappears and tunnel disappears. They went down and checked, and this dirt road is very, very dusty, and there aren't even any footprints of wherever that thing went. There were UFO sightings. Not sure how long you want me to run, but there's a cattle mutilation that I think is just amazing and totally without explanation. Should I cover that one? Or?
Yeah, please do. And again, this is where I wanted you to go, because I've heard so much about the Skinwalker Ranch and the plethora of cases that have been documented there. So please tell us about the cattle mutilation one as well.
Well, this one, I mean, there were a bunch of cattle mutilations, which is one of the reasons that Terry was enticed to sell. One of the things he noticed that they tended to happen to his most expensive cattle. But this one took place, it's calving season, 10 o'clock or so in the morning, bright, sunny day. Again, the terrain area is absolutely flat, great visibility. So he goes out and he finds a newborn calf and he tags it and weighs it, and that's to identify the calf with the mother.
Okay.
That took a little while. Then he drives across, and he finds another calf, tags it and weighs it, drives back, and the elapsed time is about 45 minutes. Calf 1 is dead. Not only is it dead, it is eviscerated, exsanguinated. One bone is missing. An ear is sliced off as if it were, cut with a razor. The tag is missing. The cow is, of course, beside herself, ranting and raving.
Mm-hmm.
And overall, there's about 20 pounds of stuff that's just absolutely missing.
And by stuff, you mean, I don't mean to interrupt you, but by stuff, you mean flesh of the cow?
Yeah, flesh.
Okay.
Yeah, meat, intestines, the various organs, etc.
Gotcha.
So the point is, the 60-pound calf now weighs about 40 pounds, and the one bone has been taken off, and there's some nicks on that. As far as exsanguination, some people suggested that the blood was there but just went into the soil. So as a matter of fact, I suggested, and they went to a slaughterhouse and got a couple quarts of blood and put it and poured it on the ground some distance away.
Mm-hmm.
But weeks later, you could say blood was poured on the ground. None of that was there with this particular calf. I might mention that we had George Annette, who was among things at DMV, and was on the site within hours. And this is a case we looked at. The science board in particular, examined all possibilities. Absolutely nothing fits, including rustlers. I mean, you shoot rustlers, and again, this is 10 o'clock in the morning in a flat open field.
Mm-hmm.
With clearly within line of sight of Terry at all times. So
it's amazing stories that come out of that place, so I'm glad you went over those. Let me focus in on the science now behind it. It sounds like you guys had quite a team behind you. So in addition to the photographs and the video cameras that you had rolling, what other type of scientific test did you do on either this particular case or more so? I'm intrigued by that one that was shot and they went over and grabbed the flesh that was shot off by the high-powered rifle. Can you do anything with that?
No, that actually occurred before we bought the ranch.
I gotcha. Okay.
So there wasn't any tissue analysis. There were things done. There was another cattle mutilation case that occurred physically just off the ranch, but George was involved, which there's a puncture wound, but it looks like, inside the heart, inside the pericardium, which is intact, is pulverized, and have no idea how you could physically do that. Did a lot of electromagnetic radiations looking for anomalies. You'd pick up some from time to time, but nothing earth-shattering. Eventually put in animal sensors, since we knew that the cattle were sensitive to some of these phenomena. Put in dog pens so to try and get the dogs to do it. Would put in all of the Rollo, Missouri experiments that were done, where we would put toys out there that were under observation, and you would find them moved around. This was obviously a bigger set. They were using an aquarium at that time. So one of the things we did try was to, provoke it or whatever was happening, and do things like bring in a front loader and just tear up the ground a bit. But again, you didn't get exactly a causal relationship. The phenomena were presented were, initiated by it, what I call the PSP, or precognitive sentient phenomena. But whatever it is, it was definitely in control no matter what we did.
To you, what is the most compelling, you went through quite a few amazing cases, but was there some kind of compelling scientific result that really proved to you, hey, there is something bizarre going on here at the Skinwalker Ranch?
Well, again, there were so many of them, and they were compelling. Some of it we relied on, eyewitness testimony. Frequently, those eyewitnesses, though, were our guys. So we're talking, PhD level scientists doing it. But the most confounding thing was how the phenomena would morph. That you would get different things and try to examine it. Not my first experience with that. If you want to talk about what we did with John Hutchison, for instance, I've had other occasions where you attempt to study things the way one normally would approach it from a scientific perspective, and it just changes. Again, it is in charge.
So what do you think it is? And we can talk about John Hutchison too, but do you have a theory on what it is?
No.
That sums that up.
Simple.
Okay.
You get into concepts of multidimensional realities and interactions of consciousness, and in the UFO field, of course, a popular area is abductions. And what's perplexing is you get different types of things happening at different places. Also point out that interaction between humans and sentient non-humans have been occurring throughout the entirety of human history, through all cultures, all over the globe. So these phenomena aren't isolated. What I might mention is that, and I do this in all talk, I think one of the big errors that we do in studying these is try to isolate single events or fields, if you will, and then pursue that to the exclusion of other data that I think are related. If I might mention UFOs, one of the things that I address there is to the UFO community, what do you mean? Because we've got little balls of light that circle around. By the way, sometimes inside, sometimes outside. We've got hard craft that are more than a mile across, and thousands of variations in between.
Okay.
And in my view, it is this plethora of variations that is problematic. And particularly if you go to the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, little gray guys from the Zeta Reticuli are dropping by. So this is why I get to the complexity of the phenomena. Might mention in my UFO book, the first line is UFOs are real, and it ends by saying whatever this is, it is more complex than we have imagined and maybe than we could imagine.
I would agree with that. I just don't think humanity has the ability as a whole to understand these types of topics. I mean, people pretend, I think, to get it, and they have the answers and so on. And I think you're right. I just don't think we have the capability of understanding it. Before I move away from Skinwalker, though, I want to ask you, you had said that Mr. Bigelow has sold the ranch. With all that activity, you would think that he would hang on to it. Did it stop, or did he just sell the property? Or if you can answer that, why did he sell it?
It did not stop. He has put his effort into Bigelow Aerospace. I might mention we had the SSE I hosted here in Las Vegas last month, which is the Society for Scientific Exploration, and we were able to take 100 people out to Bigelow Aerospace. I would encourage you to watch what's going on there. There are 2 satellites circling us right now that he personally owns, but they have been moving at warp speed. But while he has personal interest in the phenomena areas, the emphasis of Bigelow Aerospace is primarily on, what he's doing in space. And I think they're, to be fair, I had lunch with him this week, and I think they're about to make an announcement that will really change things considerably. Again, very straight world, but just amazing science and engineering that's going on.
Well, I'm eager to hear what that announcement is. Can you give us any idea of what it is, or I kind of understand if you can't?
It has to do with a contract that they now have with NASA.
Okay. Well,
and it is putting people in space.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. Well, I can't wait to hear that. Let me ask you about the scientific community as a whole. I mean, obviously, Mr. Bigelow has done a fairly extensive job over the last X amount of years, putting his own personal money into investigating not only Skinwalker, but obviously he funded quite a few other things in the field of ufology and research angles and so on. But why do you think that the scientific community, if you want to call it that, as a whole, doesn't pay attention to topics like this?
One of the topics I'm grappling with mentally, internally right now is how much is enough? And again, not just the UFO community. I think that the evidence in favor of the reality of, physical reality of UFOs is simply overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, we have a host of sensor systems that have picked them up and doing things that clearly beyond human capability at this time. You may know I was the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies and studied that for some time. And again one of the things that I note is changing in the field is more and more doctors entering it. We have cases such as Mary Neal, which I use as one of several examples, but here's a case where she was trapped underwater for minimum 15 minutes, more like 30 minutes, has an extraordinary set of circumstances, a number of physical miracles that take place, not to mention her survival being one of them, and then she's extricated there in southern Chile and Patagonia, and some Chilean people appear where there are no people, and an ambulance is waiting in an area where there are no ambulances, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that even today, most doctors go, well, it must be something else. Bottom line to your question is the problem, in my view, is the Western belief system in materialism to the exclusion of other possibilities. And I think when it starts with, it can't be, therefore it isn't.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that is getting better in respect to that more scientists and those with a background and a reputation that will look at this? Do you think that is getting better, worse, or it's just not changing at all?
Yeah, that's not a simple question.
Mm-hmm.
And having observed it for a lot longer than you have,
mm-hmm.
and I have heard repeatedly that, it's coming, everybody's going to agree with this, and I find that it tends not to be true. I guess one of the big changes that has taken place is information technology. For instance, the program we're recording right now would not have happened a decade ago.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true in television and whatnot. So a lot more information is out there. And so you tend to hear more, and it becomes, kind of self-evaluating or self-reporting, and with emphasis. Has it changed? Don't know. I've always thought we're right on the cusp, and everybody looks for the magic bullet. And as you know, we can talk about disclosure, but I keep saying disclosure has happened. How
mm-hmm.
many times do we have to say, hey, this is real, and you can pick your phenomena, before before people generally acknowledge it. Again, the belief system, which is predominant in our educational systems, suggests no, and that has been extremely difficult to overcome.
I think it comes down to people's definition of what disclosure is and the sad state that we live in today. And I'm not talking about people like you or myself or those probably listening, but the majority of people out there, they want the UFO to land on the White House lawn, that whole proverbial scenario.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of admission by the president that, yes, aliens are here, and that's it. And I don't think
this happened, which is my point. You have had presidents agree. I mean, Reagan did it. Jimmy Carter saw one. Gorbachev in Russia reported it. So you have had presidents say, this is real, and it still doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, but again, and that's a fair point. But what I mean is that people want more. Like, it's never enough for them to say, hey, Reagan saw a UFO, so you know what, I'm going to be open to this. They want more. They want Reagan to say, this is the alien, and shake hands with him, and that's the sad state that we live in.
One of the problems in the whole disclosure movement in the UFO community is what they want is not disclosure. Not only is it confirmation on the reality, but it has to be confirmation of their entire belief system. It is gray guys and Zeta Reticuli. It is Ishtar. It is this or that. And again, these things are terribly complex. The pieces never all quite fit in that. One of the things I wrote about it and did this at the SSE as well. So what we really need in the whole area of studying multiple phenomena is something like the Human Genome Project. And as you may know, that was quite an undertaking, cost $3 billion, took 9 years, and there were about 3 billion sets of genes that had to be evaluated and registered. But the way we did it was not in secret. It was to get multiple countries, lots of universities, a great exchange of information. Now, I am suggesting that to do this with the phenomena we're looking at, it's probably a couple of orders of magnitude more complex, which means that I think money-wise you're looking somewhere around $300 billion. Don't see that happening.
Yeah.
I have looked at what is the funding level for research and phenomena, and globally my estimate is we're around $10 million a year. And I've talked to other people who study these things, and they say, yep, that's probably about right. Most of that's, private funding. But for comparison, the Large Hadron Collider, which is based on the belief system of, smaller and smaller particles, it costs $1 billion a year, and we probably put $17 billion into it already. And that problem isn't nearly as complex as what we're discussing.
So what exactly would this program determine? So let's say the funding of $300 billion plus, was given to a Human Genome Project. Help me understand what that would essentially conclude.
Well, Human Genome was looking at DNA. What are the entire set of encoding for the DNA sequence with 23 chromosome pairs? It gives you a lot of possibilities the way they could line up. And again, they were able to do that. Most significant, rather than the technology of the program, was that you had multiple nations, many universities, and sharing of data. One of the problems that we run into in various phenomena is the lack of sharing of hard data. One of the reasons has to do with funding levels are so low, and people jealously guard who their funding sources are. So it definitely antithesis of what I think we need to do to solve this. Having said that, we are looking at things that would have impact on 100% of the population, particularly when you talk about continuation of consciousness beyond, physical death.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I do point out is that how we spend our money is not commensurate with our ideas of requirements, if you will. I think I mentioned earlier Large Hadron Collider, and we did come up with the Higgs boson and pentaquarks beyond that, etc. Well, that's frankly of interest to a tiny handful of theoretical physicists,
mm-hmm.
and some other people mildly interested. But as I said, if we're talking about is there life after death, that's something that's facing 100% of us,
mm-hmm.
and yet we do not fund those areas hardly at all.
You think we should?
Absolutely. I think it has tremendous implications for how we live our lives, particularly if reincarnation is real.
Mm-hmm.
If we understand the interconnectedness of the universe and everything, without getting too political, but as you know, right now, the great hue and cry over immigration issues, what does it mean if they are us?
Mm-hmm.
And how you might interact in considering them as yourself.
It's a fascinating topic, and I mean that one point that you just made is a show in itself. But as we kind of get to the last 20 minutes here, I want to ask you about something that really kind of piqued my interest. I know you've written about this in one of your books, but the particular article that I got my hands on that was just published in June of 2018 was written by you in Edge Science, Current Research and Insights. And this was about a project that you had taken part in that was much earlier than the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, or ATIP, that was revealed back in December of 2017. Now, in this particular article that you wrote, it was called the ATP Project. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, it was called the Advanced Theoretical Physics. And the reason for that name was that FOIA, which I know you're intimately familiar with, was really in full swing. That's the Freedom of Information Act, where people could request information from the government, and they were required to respond. And the thinking was that nobody was going to be requesting information on advanced theoretical physics. So it was a way to get around it. We also had the ground rules were that you not have any written records. Participants were from all of the military services, most of the intelligence community, and in aerospace, people working in fields. All of them had to have top secret SCI level clearances to participate. Had to know who you were, and it was literally an old boy net. Meaning they were all men at the time. This went on for several years while I was still on active duty. And our premise initially was, okay, somebody's doing this. We assumed Roswell was real, and that they do, in fact, want to find a way, wherever they are, to find a way to get information out. What we determined with all of those folks, agencies that I mentioned, everybody thought somebody else was doing it, had common knowledge, and the bottom line was nobody was in charge. And that pretty much is what the most recent program found, too. The things that emerge from time to time are personality dependent, i.e. you have to have somebody like me or like Lou who's, willing to pick up the guidon and run into the cannon and all of that and make it happen. So we studied cases. I can say that we looked at some highly classified things. The surprising thing to me was when I could see both the classified and the unclassified versions. Probably 98% of the information already was in the public domain.
Mm-hmm.
The things that were missing, or what you call sources and methods, like how good are the satellites and what can they really see and what do they record. So that was information that would be reasonably protected. But most of the events themselves, particularly for satellite imagery, for instance, were already there. And so we say that. I don't know, what else would you like to know?
Well, what were the specific years that you were doing this project where you were looking at these cases? What were the exact years?
I'm sorry, Alice. What was what?
The exact years that this project was underway, the ATP project?
Yeah, I think we started in '84
Mm-hmm.
and went through. Well, I retired in '88, but was able to continue when I went to Los Alamos. I did have another session there, bringing again the people together.
Mm-hmm. And
So again, it was personality dependent. So when I retired, which was not entirely what I wanted to do at the time, but if it hadn't, a lot of other things would not have happened. So.
And you said something in the beginning, which I kind of picked up on, if you don't mind me asking about it. So it sounded like when you referenced the Freedom of Information Act, which is obviously something I use quite a bit from time to time,
Right.
It sounded like you guys were potentially not having written documentation and were very aware of, at the time, people like me that would potentially come after those documents. Is that accurate? So you guys were trying to essentially circumvent people utilizing the FOIA to get a hold of what you were doing?
Correct.
Was that a
legally?
Yeah. Well, no.
No requirement to have things. No. That was exactly it. The premise was there's been some big secret program, and that we want to get it out. Like I say, what we found was very different from the expectations going in.
And why do you think that this program wasn't funded for years after that? I mean, what happened?
No, I can tell you what happened. Again, we started as a group of, literally old boy net, got together, discussed it, and I ended up moving to higher and higher levels. We were doing this ad hoc. There was no funding. Anybody who attended had to pay their own way, etc. And I got to very, very high levels. I talked to either the director or deputy director of those three-letter agencies that you know about, some you don't. Was into the secretariat level in the Department of Defense. In general, what I found was people were interested. I have one notable exception, and that's a guy I mentioned, is Walt LaBerge, who was famous scientist. He had been DDR&E, the Deputy Director for Research and Engineering, where all of these R&D programs come together, and had retired. And I was giving a briefing to a very high-level space science group, and this guy jumped up at the end. He was the head of the committee and said, "You're not supposed to know that. That's what you learn when you die."
Wow.
And many of these things, by the way, are influenced by personal belief systems. We saw that in the remote viewing program, and I know that's occurred in these other programs where I can tell you anecdotally that I've heard that there were problems, and this is with the current problem with Air Force, I believe it was Air Force General saying, "You can't do that, you're dealing with demons." I go, how do we deal with that?
Doesn't that echo something that has kind of been rumored about with ATIP as well, that there was some kind of demonic connection?
No, that again, what you're hitting on is one of the key issues, and that is the personality dependent, and that occurs not only with the people in the program, but people who get briefed. Again, for the vast majority of the folks that I briefed, and we're talking very, very senior levels, and I'll tell you what actually happened at the end. Almost all of them said, "Gee, that's interesting. Keep me informed. How can I help?" One of the things I would do is to get them pregnant. By that I mean I would always ask for something, not something big, but just help, connections, etc. And generally got that. And so finally, I don't know if you remember SDI, was known as the Star Wars program, which at the time was the biggest program in the Department of Defense. We're talking $5 billion. It was a high visibility target as well. Congress was, after them. And so I met with the director of SDI, who clearly had no idea what we were talking about when we started. An Air Force 3-star general. In fact, I started the briefing, and I had people with me from other agencies, and he stopped me at about 5 or 10 minutes and said, "Wait a minute, who are you guys really?" And back around the room, and it does. By the time we were done, he said, "As an old fighter pilot, I find this very interesting." And we were asking for money at that point, and his response was, "I can't touch this. If you can tell me what to look for, we're going to monitor space in a way that's never been done before. I am willing to include things in our algorithms that would spot," and we thought it from an SDI perspective that you really did want to know what was flying around, because you're putting response for international war on a hair trigger with that, is based on the nature of the program. He says, "But I can't touch it." And the quote was, "I'm doing some really hairy stuff now, but if I get caught doing something like this, I'll get hammered." And he did. He did lose $1 billion in funding. And the point was, this is, again, not rights and wrongs. It was, if the perception is that I'm spending money frivolously, I will be seen as not a good steward of public funds, and they won't just take that money, they will take other money as well. And
why do you think that there's such an apprehension by the government as a whole to fund these types of projects? And again, what you're telling me about the ATP project years ago kind of echoes the same end of the official line anyway with ATIP.
It is exactly the same thing. And the point is that, again, it's back to the personality dependent, not just individuals who might be interested in proceeding, but the supervision or supervisory level above. People do not understand how the funding system within DOD works. I know it's popular to say there's trillions missing and all of that. Not really true. You're talking more about accounting measures as opposed to, where did the money go. But even in what you call the black world, there's fierce competition for dollars. And the point was, and I think the reason that Alessandro got funded is that they were at a low level. And I will give you that, they say, $22 million, and that's over a period of 4 or 5 years. I might mention the remote viewing program. You hear about the same thing, $20 million over a number of years. In DOD funding, you're talking lunch money. we are not talking large amounts of dollars, and there are areas of discretionary funding that can occur as long as you keep below certain funding thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
The point there is when you reach a certain amount, and those are set by law, you then have to go and report to higher and higher levels. And so if you're talking a few $1 million a year, yeah, you can probably hide that pretty well. And what happened here, like I say, in our case, A, retired, but B, the people who went to funding just felt they could not take the institutional risk of being associated with it. And I think you see much of the same thing from what I'm understanding from the most recent program. Similar things happened there. That they, as you get, the visibility goes up and the money goes up. I'm also understanding from, again, some of the people involved in the current program that, money came down, and because of the wording that was used, other agencies saw it and said, "Oh, that's what I do."
Mm-hmm.
Anomalous threats. I deal with advanced threats, so therefore I want that money, and we're able to actually can't say really steal it, but reappropriate the money, if you will.
It's an interesting topic. It's one that intrigues me. I'm looking forward to more official documents that come out on ATIP, but it's one that I will say with confidence it needs to be on the books. I think it does need to be funded. I mean, it's clear evidence that whatever this phenomenon is, it is a threat of some kind, and I don't think we should just laugh it away or not fund it. Alien or not, whatever it is, it's creating a problem.
Well, I'm going to take a different position,
Sure.
Although I must admit, and in the article I say the same thing. When I was doing the Advanced Theoretical Physics program, I was couching it in terms of a threat. And the reason is that the Department of Defense is just that, defense. They are responsible for threats, and so you have to show a relationship between what you're spending money on and that. And I know this is not a popular stance, even with some of the people involved who still maintain the threat issue. My question then becomes, how much money are you willing to invest in areas where you have a very low probability of getting answers or returns? Again, I get back to the complexity of what we're dealing with. I think, let's understand, I certainly think it ought to be studied. I am all in favor of that, but I think it needs to be done at a much, much higher level, and it ought to be done in the open.
So in short, you don't feel it's a threat?
Not. I mean, I can make that argument, and I did. But if you look at, let's go back to Condon. I mean, remember, the question to Condon was not, are UFOs real? This is the Air Force study in 68 and released in 69. The question was, is this a threat? And you would have to say, well, we haven't been invaded, so it does not look like it actually was a threat, therefore he got the right answer. What he got wrong was when it said, and there's no scientific value in it. I think there's extreme scientific value in studying these areas. But again, the complexity is so great. Now, one of the things, and I think I mentioned in the article, there's a couple things that the government does bring to it, and that is advanced sensor systems, and some of which the capabilities would be protected. And they do have some brain power that can be patched, i.e. national labs and other government labs and all of that. The detriment to government involvement, though, is that they also have a propensity for secrecy. And I will be the first to say over-secrecy. And that applies in basically all areas, not just the study of phenomena, if you will. But again, it's, if I'm right, and all of these phenomena are related, you do not have an expectation that the government should be involved in studying continuation of consciousness or poltergeists or any of those things, and certainly would not have lead responsibility. So confirming your belief system is not a requirement for the government, but I do think it's a requirement for humanity.
I think the one thing that after looking at, literally thousands of pages, whether it be on mind control or remote viewing or some of the phenomena that has gone on the books, it seems like they do make strides in scientific discoveries and then just seemingly drop it and ignore it and cut all the funding and say, no, we're not interested. Very similar to the Condon.
What you're hitting on again is the interest of personalities at various levels. What you've seen repeatedly is, some funding at very modest levels, but when you have to compete, and particularly for big dollars, and I think what's required are huge, obviously. The potential problems just don't keep up with today's issues.
Yeah.
What's burning the barn today? We've been at war, I point out, and since 2001 continuously. So when you have to answer the question of in funding compared to what?
It really is a fascinating topic and something I could talk to you for quite some time. Sadly, the hour has gone by much quicker than I would want it to, but Dr. Alexander can be reached online for all those who want to look up his books, and I do highly recommend them. He has an amazing history as a person, but his research is top-notch. So I would recommend going to www.johnbalexander.com. Again, I will link everything that we've talked about and referenced in this episode on the show notes. If you don't know how to get there, go to www.theblackvault.com/show notes. Look for this episode with Dr. John Alexander. And thank you again for taking the time with me today. I really do enjoy the conversation, but more so just getting you on and being able to pick your brain a little bit.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Although that concludes my interview with Dr. John Alexander, don't go away. Coming up, this episode's document of interest in TBV Unredacted. In this episode's TBV Unredacted, I'm switching it up a little bit, and I am speaking about an FBI file. Now, the day that this episode dumped onto the internet and on all of those subscription feeds was July 18th, 2018. For those that don't know, this would have been Nelson Mandela's 100th birthday. Now, when he died back in 2013, I had filed for his FBI files, along with quite a few other researchers. Now, when anybody famous dies under the Freedom of Information Act, but more so the Privacy Acts, you can go after documents related to that particular person. While they're alive, you can still do that, but you do need their permission. Once they pass away, and you can reasonably prove, whether it be with a death certificate or a obituary from a reputable source, then the FBI will process the request, look for files on that particular person, hopefully declassify them, and release them. Now, the Black Vault has literally hundreds of thousands of pages of various FBI files on people from being celebrity backgrounds, or sports figures, politicians here in America, politicians worldwide. You name it, I've probably gone after FBI files on that person, or I should. So let me know if you have any recommendations. But I literally will collect anything that the FBI might have. I think that there's immense value to these files, and there are way too many occasions that I can cite for you where the FBI literally has destroyed records on a particular person. What are they hiding? Are they hiding anything? Was this just a normal destruction of documents per their records retention schedule. Who knows? But I just don't think in this day and age, and I've said this before on this show, anything should be destroyed. So I'll go after the documents, get them, post them online, so you can download them all for free. Now, back to the date. Well, it would have been Nelson Mandela's 100th birthday. I went after his files in 2013 and actually eventually got them. I was able to get these documents declassified. They were also posted on their FBI FOIA website. And again, there were quite a few other researchers as well that were going after this file because it was fairly sought after. Now, the reason why I'm profiling this in this episodes of TBV Unredacted is it really goes to show you what the FBI is doing behind the scenes. And when you look at the files on Nelson Mandela, you realize that he was watched. After he got out of prison, the FBI really was labeling him as potentially a communist threat. Now, this was against everything that, he stood for and what history shows what Nelson Mandela accomplished. But the FBI didn't feel that way. And they were watching him and seeing his meetings and keeping tabs on his travels and who he was meeting with and when he was meeting with them. You'll also find extensive documents within the file on his trip to America and how the United States was watching his security detail and then offering their protection as well. And it really is that inside look that the FBI sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes is fairly misguided with their labels that they're putting on these people and that they're watching. And Nelson Mandela is just one of many, many, many examples that was watched by the FBI for various reasons. And you'll also note from his file that a lot of the records are actually still classified, secret, and even top secret. One document you'll find in more than 340 pages worth was classified top secret at the time that it was written. Although they declassified it, quote unquote, most of it is redacted and blacked out. So the question mark is, what exactly were they watching? What were they doing? What were they involved with when it came to watching Nelson Mandela? And this really should serve, because this is the first story at TBV Unredacted where I've talked about an FBI file. This should really serve as kind of the tip of the iceberg for you. If you're looking into investigating documents, if you're looking into files on particular people, check theblackvault.com because, like I said, I've got hundreds of thousands of pages just of FBI files on all sorts of people. But pick somebody, and if you don't know how to go after the file, let me know, and I'll help you out. Or if you want me to go after it, I'll go after it. But it shows you how many people really were watched that maybe shouldn't have been, at least on the levels that they were being watched on, based on accusations, or behind-the-scenes accusations anyway, of things that weren't true. And so I really highly recommend you just thumb through. I know it's tough to read 340 pages, especially when it comes to an FBI file. Sometimes it's not fun. But that being said, take a look at it. Get an idea of what the FBI truly is doing behind the scenes. Sadly, and because I do have a lot of respect for the men and women within the FBI and actually intelligence agency wide, I have a lot of respect for all of them. But in the same respect, we have to learn what they're doing. It's our money that's going towards this, and we're financing these investigations and so on. So we shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. Why did you do this? Why did you accuse him of that? Why were you watching him here? Why were you keeping tabs on his meeting with so-and-so? Those are the questions that need to be asked. And so this file kind of serves as that tip of the iceberg on his 100th birthday to show what the FBI really was watching, what they were doing. So take a look at that. It's linked in the show notes, or just search theblackvault.com for Nelson Mandela, and you will come up with the FBI files page and in his file. It is definitely worth reading. That being said, thank you all for listening. That's another edition of the Black Vault Radio, and make sure you drop me a line on when you'd like to see those times on Friday night, those meetups. I'll try and make it to every one. I can't promise you, but I will schedule them for these broadcasts to go out on Facebook Live and YouTube. So let me know what time works for you, and I'll see if I get a consensus of what might be a fun meetup time. That way you all have a chat room and can discuss the show as it unfolds. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Black Vault Radio.